Welcome to the Great Loop Radio podcast, brought to you by America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. We're dedicated to sharing Great Loop information and inspiration with those actively cruising, planning for, or dreaming about a Great Loop adventure. I'm Kim Russo. I'm the director of AGLCA. Today we're continuing our 2025 update series, which we started a few weeks ago. We have heard from Cindy Lewis on financing. We have heard from Scott Miller on what to expect surveying a boat. And we have heard from Michael Martin on what the marketplace is like right now. But today we're bringing in what has been kind of the key piece for a few years now. We're going to talk about marine insurance, and we will be bringing back John Horton with Jack Martin and Associates to fill us in. Before we jump into the conversation, though, I want to take a moment to recognize and thank our Admiral sponsors who support AGLCA at the highest level. They are Great Loop Yacht Sales, Passage Maker Trawler Fest, Skipper Bob Publications, and Waterway Guide Media. As always, we encourage our listeners and viewers to support these businesses that support the Great Loop. And let's get right down to the conversation. John Horton, thank you for joining me again this year.
Thank you for having me, Kim. It's always a pleasure to get with you guys, and I can't wait till the year comes around when I have great news to deliver.
We're all hoping for that too. And in the meantime, you've been a great sport. We put you on the spot year after year. But first of all, for those who maybe are new to listening to our podcast, tell us about yourself.
So my name is John Horton. I work with Jack Martin and Associates. We're a yacht insurance agency headquartered in Annapolis, Maryland. I've been with them for 21 years. We write insurance all over the world. Prior to that, my family owns a marina on the Tennessee River on Lake Guntersville in Alabama. I was a marine service manager there. And obviously I love boats, love what I do, and live here in Annapolis on Kent Island in the middle of the bay and go to all the events. And, always interesting to hear what you guys are doing and to be a part of it.
Yeah, and just another plug for those listening. Our Looper Lifestyle Seminar is coming up in Chattanooga, Tennessee in March. John will be with us as well. So all of the presenters actually from this series will be with us to give you a more in-depth look at the types of things that they're filling us in on today. But John, we've kind of alluded to the idea that securing insurance has been one of the more challenging parts of the boat buying process since around 2020. So, give us the high level view. What do you expect to happen in 2025? More of the same, or are we starting to see some relief?
Starting to see just a tiny, tiny bit of relief. And, we'll take what we can get with these underwriters right now as far as what would be acceptable for them. They're starting to take on, look at more some captain training. They're looking at a little bit of experience as opposed to only ownership. I'm seeing a lot higher premiums than we've seen even last year, and premiums were up last year. So they're definitely taking rate, and that's, directly because of last year's storm season. I think we ended up paying out quite a bit of money. So that's pushing it. Some of the underwriting updates they're requiring now are like itineraries for people. So some of you people doing the loop, they may want to see over the next year, what's your planned itinerary? Just so that, they're charging you correctly. Mm-hmm. And also that, they're quoting you correctly. So if you're only going to be in South Carolina, there's no reason to have the whole loop navigation. They're not going to hold you to that itinerary, but they do want to make sure that, you kind of have a plan in place and that they're quoting you correctly, really. Right. Starting seeing some higher named storm deductibles. Some of these companies are flirting with like a 10% deductible for named storms. And some of them are even moving the line a little bit higher up, where they're requiring, instead of being north of 32 degrees north latitude, they may want you north of 34 degrees north latitude. So they're all just, again, trying to flex and gyrate to make their books profitable.
Yeah. A lot to unpack there, John. A couple of things. One of the things that is new, and I haven't really heard you mention before, is the itinerary. So tell us, what kind of detail are they looking? That's a challenging thing for somebody who's planning the loop next year.
Yeah,
I'm assuming they're not looking for day by day, but more maybe month by month. But what are you seeing that they'll accept as an itinerary?
It's pretty much a form that says January, February, March. And then they want you to write next to it, where do you think you're going to be in January, February, March? And it may be Florida, Great Lakes, for a bunch of months, whatever it might be. They're not going to want you to pin it down to a certain marina or anything like that. But it's they're wanting to make sure, that you are actually doing the loop and that you're not just, cruising the Gulf and going back up to Lake Gunnersville during the summer months.
Yeah. Now, so if you are doing the loop, because we've got a lot of members too who are either pre or post loop and are just doing some local or extended cruising, but not a whole loop. Are you finding that when they're asking for that itinerary, are they looking favorably upon doing the loop? Because you're kind of, if you're doing it on the seasonal agenda, you're out of hurricane season, or are they looking at it that those boats are being used for a lot of hours and therefore the risk is higher just by nature of being underway that much more?
It varies by company. Most companies, the premium's lower for someone doing the Great Loop as
Hmm.
opposed to someone who's doing just the East Coast. Because with the Great Loop navigation, quite a big part of it is inland,
Right.
non-tidal waterways,
Hmm.
where there isn't a big, hurricane and not a big tidal influence. Whereas if you're just East Coast, you're always tidally influenced and you're always, subject to some type of named storm.
The other thing that you mentioned that was different is the location that they want the boat to be during the hurricane season. So you said some underwriters are moving from 32 degrees north latitude to 34. 32 is generally, I think, pretty close to the Florida Georgia line, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Any idea where 34 moves that line to?
So 32 is Savannah, 31
Okay.
is the Florida Georgia border, 36 is Cape Hatteras.
Okay.
So I would say 34 is probably Oriental, somewhere around in there, maybe a little south of
Interesting.
Oriental.
Okay.
And that's only if you're coastal. If you're inland, they don't want, they're not worried about the 34 degrees if you're on the inland waterways.
Okay. So for loopers coming south on the inland waterways in the fall, waiting for hurricane season to be over, they should not have to stay further north based on this than they were before.
No, not at all. Not at
Excellent.
all.
Okay. Um, you kind of alluded to this past storm season being another major one. And I know when you give a longer presentation, you've got charts that explain, this is the extent of the hurricane seasons and the storm damage and the extensiveness of the claims, which is part of what's driving this challenging insurance market. 2024, was a very active season with some very damaging storms. Um, you kind of mentioned that premiums are going up. Are there other impacts yet from the 2024 season that we should be aware of?
Really just seeing kind of the premiums going up and that gyration that I mentioned about the storm deductibles are being
Hmm.
they're bumping them up with certain carriers with boats in certain locations, and they're also flexing that north-south line. But I mean, we had 18 storms, paid out $128 billion. That's the second biggest payout in history for
Hmm.
hurricanes on the East Coast.
Wow.
So that's definitely pushing things along quite a bit.
Interesting. Um, and I think for people doing the loop who perhaps have owned their boat for a long time or are planning to keep it after the loop, it is so interesting how the loop affects that premium because our boat, for example, and you've been insuring it for us, but was originally home ported on the Great Lakes and the insurance was very inexpensive. Then relocated to Charleston and it went up a good bit. But then when we started on the loop, it came back down because we were out of hurricane season. So it's all about those storms. And I think for people who are from the inland states or Great Lakes, don't know the impact as much. But for those of you who are on the East Coast or in Florida and getting ready to do the loop, you're actually going to save probably a lot of money when you're on your insurance when you're doing the loop. So make sure that your insurance agent knows what your plans are. Um,
Absolutely, and shop companies as well,
yeah.
because I'm seeing more and more companies coming to the table with the Great Loop navigation, with a better understanding of what the loop's all about, and that's really providing some better terms.
Yeah.
And then there's other companies that are still, stuck in the old ages that are quoting you for the loop the same way they quote you as a north-south boat.
Gotcha. So I know in the past few years, something that was different was that insurance costs, the underwriters were really looking at previous boat ownership as opposed to previous boating experience. You mentioned that they are coming back to requirements that you must have a captain aboard, which is a costly undertaking, but it's better than them not putting that option on the table and just saying you have to have previous boat ownership. So is that you mentioned that that's changing a little bit back towards experience. What kind of experience are you seeing that the insurers are really wanting loopers to have?
They want to see that you have some kind of experience on a boat similar to what you're buying. So if you're going out there and you're buying a 45-foot boat, they'd like to see you have a week charter, or 2 week charter or whatever it might be on a boat in the 40-foot range somewhere. In addition to that, they want to see that you have some experience on the waters where you're trying to insure. So if you always owned a boat on Lake Texoma and you're going to go do the Great Loop, you've never been in tidal waters, never been on the coast, never had to deal with any of that kind of stuff, they want to see some experience there, and they may want to get you checked out by a captain there as well. But for the most part, it's still very heavily leaning towards prior ownership. Those guys, their data tables have shown that the prior ownership is I guess works out the best for them on
Okay.
the back end as an indicator of what kind of risk you're going to be.
Yeah. And so you have to start somewhere. So the prior ownership can be a challenge. I know at one time they were kind of looking for you to have owned a boat within 10 feet in length. So you could jump up from your previous ownership about 10 feet. Does that still seem to be the number? I know it depends on the company too.
That's still kind of the magic number with most of the companies out there. They have kind of bumped up the bottom number. It used to be they would insure you on anything up to 30 feet, no matter what. With most of them, they'll insure you on anything up to 35 feet, no matter
Okay.
what.
Hmm.
So that number has kind of come up a little bit on the bottom side from what we're seeing.
Okay, so the news here, kind of the takeaway for loopers who maybe weren't aware of this. If you've never owned a boat, it sounds like you should be looking for something 35 feet or less to do the loop
Yes.
to make the insurance challenge a little bit easier. I'm not going to tell you if it's your first boat ever and it's 45 feet, you won't get insured. It's just more challenging, and there probably will be less insurers willing to write that policy for you, which could mean the premium is higher, of course. But so then if you have owned a boat, or let's say you want to do the loop in a 50-foot boat, for some people, we've been seeing that kind of requires what, for lack of a better word, we've called a step up boat, where people may be buying a 30 or a 40 footer and then jumping up to that 50. Has that changed in 2025, or is that you're thinking that pattern might have to continue?
For whatever reason, the underwriters have decided boats over 50 feet in length are kind of, they're their own little animal.
Mm-hmm.
Once you get over 50 feet, they're going to want to see plenty of prior ownership, plenty of good experience. You can definitely expect to have a captain on board, even for certain passages. Like if you were going over to the Bahamas, some companies will require you to have an extra crew member on board just for that one passage. Especially if you get down into the Caribbean, places like that, they may even want two crew members on board for the bigger boats.
Interesting.
Their thinking there is you've got a bigger vessel, it's harder to single hand. You're going to need some hands on board.
Yeah, excellent. Let's take a quick break and play a message from one of our sponsors. We'll come back in a minute and pick up the conversation. Stay with Eldine Shipyard on your Great Loop cruise or when leaving your boat north for the winter. Eldine Shipyard is a family-owned and operated first-class marina and boatyard, and we've been serving Lake Michigan boaters for more than 100 years. Whether it's time to relax at our pool and hot tubs or be hauled out with our 35 or 70-ton travel lifts for repairs or winter storage, Eldine Shipyard is a one-stop location for everything a looper might need. We're in southwestern Michigan, 5 miles west of Holland, where Lake Macatawa joins southern Lake Michigan. For those flying in and out, the Grand Rapids International Airport is less than an hour away. Looking for dock space? Meet DockShare, the leader in private dock rentals and commonly referred to as the Airbnb for docks. DockShare connects boaters with property owners renting out their unused dock space. Whether you need short-term dockage or a long-term slip, DockShare has you covered. With over 90% of listings within 10 miles of the Great Loop, you'll find serene alternatives to crowded marinas, even in regions lacking public docks. It's easy. Search, message hosts, and book, all in one place. Visit dockshare.app today and discover your next docking destination. We're back on the Great Loop Radio podcast. My guest today is John Horton. He is with Jack Martin and Associates. They are a longtime AGLCA sponsor, and John, we certainly appreciate that sponsorship, and we appreciate all of the details you're giving us today, because we've been doing this. I guess this is probably the 5th year where it's been challenging to find insurance, and the prices have been higher, but we're still catching people by surprise. We
Right.
still have people who are going to buy a boat, and if you're going to buy a pricier boat, most likely you're not viewed by most things as a risk. You're not a credit risk.
Right.
Homeowners insurance, car insurance, no problem, same day. So people are really kind of surprised by this. So we've been talking about how experience is coming back into favor, having previous experience and previous ownership. So one of the things that some of the insurance companies ask for now is kind of a boating resume. So is there a form for that as well? How do you recommend people get that information together so that when they're ready to go for insurance and go through underwriting, they've got the details ready?
Yeah, we have a form I can send you. It's basically going to outline, here are the previous boats that I've owned, the make, model, length of the boat, how many years I owned it. Here's the next boat that I've owned. And then there's another field for the boats that you've operated. All of that same information, make, model, length, years operated, and also where did you operate these boats? Once again, they're very interested to see if you're going coastal with a boat. They want to know that you've operated boats in salt water before, that you're not just jumping from a lake to salt water. They're going to ask questions like, do you have any prior claims? If so, what was the nature of the claim? When did it occur? How much was paid out? Trying to think what else is on that resume form. Um, where you boated, boating courses taken, if you've
Hmm.
passed any classes, if you have any licenses like Coast Guard licenses that you've obtained, all of that kind of information is what they're going to gather from you with the form, and then you pitch it up, and the underwriter takes a look and gives you the thumbs up or the thumbs down.
We're all hoping for the thumbs up.
Yeah,
But that's helpful. As you're out there and gaining experience doing different things, it's certainly keep track of that, keep a record of that, because when it comes time to fill in the form and hand it over for insurance, it's just going to be easier if you already remember all of any chartering you've done or any even if you're a passenger on a friend's boat, you can talk about those days on that boat, can't you, John, in the kind of the
yeah,
experience
I
area?
think you can. I think it's what they call water time.
Hmm.
So as long as you have some on the water time, I'm not sure how much it'll factor into you being, buying a 50 or 60-foot boat, but
Right.
it'll definitely help, with the smaller stuff.
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about the people, the owners of the boat, but the boat matters too when you're going for insurance. So, tell us a little bit about parameters about the vessel that are going to affect the ability to get a policy and the cost.
Sure. Age of the boat's probably the biggest thing we're seeing now, where I have insurers that'll insure boat up to 50 years in age, but we write with 18 different companies. I only have one that'll write a boat up to 50 years of age, and it has to have a terrific survey. Once you get, anything 30 or under, most carriers will take a stab at. Once you get over 30 feet, then it's all going to come down to the survey, and the amount of players at the table are fewer. That also applies to multi-hull vessels like your catamarans.
Mhm.
There's certain companies out there that just aren't interested in insuring multi-hulls. Apparently, they have a high incident of lightning strikes.
Interesting.
Um, so it's that they just, company like Markel just does not like multi-hulls at all. Travelers is another company. Travelers doesn't like houseboats. So, not that there are a lot of houseboats on the loop, but there's a few on the inland waterways for sure.
Yeah.
And they're just not a player for those. And another thing is your speed of the vessel. Most looper boats aren't go fast boats, so you don't have to worry about that. And then the last thing, lithium ion batteries. We're seeing a lot of insurance companies that are surcharging for people who have lithium ion batteries, just because of when you have a fire, it just goes right through the hull of the boat and the boat takes on water. So that's a new, I guess, new within the last 4 or 5 years, where you're seeing more and more companies paying attention to that.
Yeah. So a couple of follow-up questions to that. You mentioned, boats 50 years and newer, you have one company that'll write. Did you say it was 30 years and newer that most of them will write?
Yep. Yeah,
So if
if
you're
it's
in the
30 years
mark,
or less, pretty much every company is a player for that.
okay.
Um, you know,
Um, Size restrictions. I know we've talked about boats 50 feet and up are, a different animal, so to speak, from the insurance company perspective. Um, so is there a sweet spot on size that you're seeing for loopers that is easiest to get a reasonably priced, if such a thing exists,
yeah,
premium?
I'd say, 40 to 45 feet is probably the kind of the sweet spot that I see most loop boats. Anything 40 to 50 is probably a better range there, but the majority are between 40 and 45 feet. With some nice 36 monks, 36 carvers, sprinkled in there as well that are looping.
I know it's especially in this kind of audio format, it's hard to walk through the numbers. I'm not a numbers person, and I know in the past there was some boats between this many feet and this dollar value, and lots of numbers and tables involved in all this. That's a little bit hard to wrap your brain around when people are just listening to this, some may be viewing it. But is there still a question mark or a challenge with some of the higher end boats with insurance besides the price tag that's going to come with it? Does a more expensive boat need to be in a different size or different age range than perhaps a less expensive boat? I don't know if that's a viable
Yeah, and I
question.
think that kind of goes hand in hand. Usually
Mm-hmm.
the newer the boat, the higher the value.
Mm-hmm.
Traditionally on those boats, I'm seeing once you get most companies will insure up to $1 million in value on a boat pretty regularly. Once you go over 1 million, then there's a few companies that drop off that just don't want to insure higher than that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also some players that don't insure boats until they get over $1 million.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got like Travelers Luxury Yacht, St. Paul Marine, companies like that, Cincinnati, that are bigger players for the higher value vessels. So it's like you learn how to do something one way. There's a whole new animal to learn once it gets over a higher value, but it's definitely more challenging, and there's more onus on the owner when you get
Mm-hmm.
into the higher value, bigger boats. And once again, you're looking at possible crew coverage, probably broader navigation.
Mm-hmm.
And then usually the limits on those luxury yacht policies are quite broad. As far as, really high numbers for personal effects, they may insure art and things like that may be on board the boat. So
Yeah.
it's just a different animal altogether.
Yeah. Well, while we're kind of talking about those personal effects and what is insured aboard, because most loopers are aboard pretty close to full time and have a lot of their stuff aboard and things like that. So one of the things that worries me for our members, as insurance premiums have gone up and coverage has been harder, um, in the past, there have been boat policies and yacht policies, which are two different things. And I know we've talked in the past about that line starting to blur. So it's not as crystal clear. And whenever I hear somebody telling me they got this great deal on insurance, I'm always concerned about what the terms of that is and what actually is covered and what is not. So tell us historically, what is a boat policy and what is a yacht policy? And then we'll talk about what that means to loopers.
So a boat policy traditionally was for boats 26 feet or less. That's a boat. When you go over 26 feet, it becomes a yacht in the insurance world. So once that traditionally 26 feet and under policies, boat policies would allow you to go anywhere in the US because they're thinking you're going to trailer these boats and, go to Maine to Florida, any of the 48 states up to a certain number of miles offshore. Yacht policies were much more restrictive navigation wise, but they added in a lot of ancillary coverages for things like your dinghy, for lower electronics deductibles, um, higher personal effects limits, pollution spill liability, a lot of things that weren't included on the traditional boat policies. Well, these boat policy companies, like your Progressives and State Farms, are now insuring boats up to 50 feet in length. But they're still keeping the same basics of the boat policy and just kind of injecting some steroids into it, for lack of a better term, where they're adding in, now you can add it to boats. You can have a dinghy and the boat all under the boat policy. You can have higher limits for personal effects. They now insure pollution spill liability. So these things are, they're making it very similar. What you want to look at, the big thing is your dinghy tender covered. And then also, what are the partial loss terms? On a lot of boat policies, if you have a partial loss, which what that means, if you have $100,000 boat and you just ding the hull of the boat, and you've got a $25,000 claim, that's a partial loss because it's not the whole value of the boat. How is that going to pay out? Is it paying out on an actual cash value basis? Is it paying with replacement parts? Is it paying with like parts? And with a lot of the yacht policies, you see where there's not the depreciation applied that there are on boat policies. So that's, if you can figure out those terms, a lot of times the policies are very similar. These days they are. They didn't used to be, but now they're getting pretty similar.
Yeah. And, like I said, I worry about our members who may not realize that there's even a difference. And I don't know how many of us really read through an insurance policy. We should, but
Right.
there's a lot of stuff in there. So really you want to get to the point that you understand it. But I guess the bottom line there, John, is some of the coverages you mentioned are things that loopers, you probably can't even call it a boat policy versus a yacht policy anymore, but you're going to want to look for the personal effects coverage, the dinghy, as you said, the environmental. I can't remember exactly how you phrased that.
Yeah, pollution spill.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
if you have a
OPA.
fuel spill or anything like that, um, everybody's risk tolerance is different. So you may be able to find a quote unquote boat policy for your yacht that is very affordable and not have some of those coverages. And that doesn't make it wrong. I just hope that
Yeah.
everyone understands what they're covered for and what they're not, because certainly nobody wants to have a policy and have a claim and then have trouble with that claim. And you kind of mentioned, agreed upon value versus um, cash value, is it?
Yeah, actual cash value.
So go ahead and explain the difference between those two so those shopping for insurance know what they're dealing with there too, because I think that's also a big thing.
Sure it is. Sure. You want to, if you're getting an insurance policy, make sure it's an agreed value policy. What that means is that $100,000 boat, if you have a total loss, they're going to write you a check for $100,000 minus the deductible. If you have an actual cash value policy, they're going to go and look at the Marine Blue Book and say, well, today the boat is worth this amount of money. You've put 800 hours on it, so we're going to subtract X amount of dollars for depreciation. And here's your check minus the deductible. So
Right.
it's once again risk tolerance. I know a lot of people, especially with the older boats, they're fine with an ACV policy, but if you can get agreed value, that would be my suggestion for sure.
Yeah, that's helpful. Um, Completely unfair question, but I'm going to put you on the spot once again. Um, because I know it's all across the board, but for a boat that is planning to do the loop, um, let's just call the average looper boat is still about 40 feet. And I'm not going to ask you for one number, but what's kind of the range of what you're seeing in policies? If you want me to put an age on the boat, I will, but are we
I'd
talking
say,
these days $5,000 in premiums or $15,000 in premiums for a boat like that?
yeah, say a 40-foot boat, the big things pushing the premium are going to be the age, the length, and the value.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say it's a $200,000 40-foot boat that's 20 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I would say a fair estimate there is probably 2,500 to 3,000 to 3,500 a year
Okay.
to do the Great Loop. Hopefully on the lower end there, but you never know. And I hate even throwing ballparks out right now because these underwriters are coming back with some pretty outrageous numbers.
Yeah, and of course, if you are going to keep the boat at any time for an extended period on the East Coast or Florida, whether it's the Gulf Coast or the East Coast of Florida, all bets are off, and you can probably
Yes.
triple, quadruple, who knows?
Yep. Yep.
And yeah, we won't hold you to those numbers, Don, because we know that it's really kind of a wild place out there right now with getting some of these quotes back, and I know you're just as surprised sometimes when they come back as the boat owner is. So appreciate that range because I just wanted people to understand how much of their budget towards the Great Loop should they be figuring on this? So that's helpful, and I'm sure everyone's clear that that's just a guess at this point. And we're here recording in mid-January of 2025, and you could be listening to this in 2 years, and it could be completely different. So,
I,
um,
that John guy's crazy.
so because of all of these things we've discussed and some of the challenges in the marketplace, securing insurance has really and you've encouraged people to move that forward in the boat buying process. If you're buying a car, it's kind of the last thing you do. Um, it's become different for boats because it's difficult. For somebody like Cindy Lewis, who's arranging financing for people to work with that client if they're going to get to the end and not have insurance, or for a broker who is traveling for you to show you boats, to preview boats, and then finding out you can't get insurance. So it's really been moved up in the boat buying process. So how does one go about getting quote unquote pre-approved for insurance, especially if they don't know yet what boat they're buying?
Sure. No, great question. Back in the day, like you mentioned, we were like the auto guys, where we were the last kink in the chain, and someone would kind of kick us at 5 o'clock on a Friday and say, "Hey, I need insurance in 10 minutes," and we'd make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
Those days are over, unfortunately, and we're kind of at the front of the process. So my suggestion, once you find a boat, you're ready to make an offer on it, you're ready to go into a contract of some kind on it. Before you enter into that contract, that's when you want to get an insurance quote on the boat. Let's make sure you're insurable and that it's within your price range before you waste your time chasing down the boat, going and flying out to see the boat, sending your broker to see it, hiring surveyors and everything else. Make sure you can get insurance on it.
Yeah. And so if you're early in the process, but perhaps you're going to be working with a broker who wants to know that you are insurable, is it possible to go to you and say, we're looking at, to give you a boat as an example, kind of like we just did with a very quote unquote typical looper boat, 40 feet, 20 years old. Is it possible to give you something like that to see if you can get it insured, or is that a waste of your time?
No, not at all. It's like, to me, my industry is the one that's causing this hiccup in the process. So if you find a boat, you want to make an offer on it, reach out to us and, we can put together some preliminary numbers for you.
Yeah.
And again, make sure you are insurable, before you waste everyone's time and your time.
Yeah. And, we're hoping, I think you and I both kind of anecdotally are starting to see a little bit more wiggle room there while the policies are available, it seems, even if the premium is higher. So for some, that's good news. Where a couple years ago, perhaps they wouldn't have gotten insured. There may be more of a possibility now. And as we've had these discussions, we've always kind of said, it's not the best marketplace, but we're not telling you not to try. We're not telling you you won't
Right.
get insurance, because just as you're surprised sometimes by the quotes that come back on how expensive they are, sometimes it works the other way. Sometimes somebody you didn't think would get insured for whatever
True.
reason ends up with a policy. So just I hope the message that everyone's taking from this is it's not a hopeless situation if you don't check all those boxes and meet all those parameters, but just start doing your fact finding. And John, you've been super helpful in giving us what some of those parameters are so people can kind of set a realistic expectation as they start to get out there and boat shop. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing all of your experience today. We're looking forward to seeing you in Chattanooga. So anybody who's watching or listening who is interested in that event, you can go to greatloop.org, go to the event menu, and you will see the Looper Lifestyle coming to Chattanooga at the end of March. So I hope we'll see you all out there. John, once again, thank you so much. We appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me, Kim. Really
Yeah, we
appreciate it.
appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who's watched or listened today. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Great Loop Radio podcast. Until then, safe cruising.